couple of years ago, we went to see the Cavern Beatles. I was thinking about doing a Stars in Their Eyes reference, you see, but as soon as that's not been on telly for over a decade, I thought that might have missed the mark. The Cavern Beatles, in case you don't know, they're a tribute act. We had a fantastic evening over there in the Corro of the Beatles' greatest hits, performed by a group of musicians who copied the outfits, the accents, and even, apparently, I don't know enough about the Beatles, but even the mannerisms of the Fab Four, like Paul's little head bob. Once a band or a musician has stopped touring, or in the case of the Beatles, half of them have died, a tribute act is the next best thing, isn't it, to seeing them live, because live music is always better. Now, I say this because Genesis 26 reads a bit like Isaac's tribute act to his father Abraham. I know it's been a while since we were there earlier in Genesis, but if you remember the earlier chapters of this book, you'll probably get a feeling of déjà vu here, as Isaac seems to follow step by step a path that his father walked years before. Now, this morning we'll walk through the 6 main tracks of Abraham's greatest hits. You could find more. Even as I was reading that chapter before, I was noticing things that I'm not really going to have time to talk about. We're going to look at the 6 main, sort of, the favourite ones, the ones we put on the mixtape. We're going to think about that and then what it all means. So the first track, and we're in verse 1 here, is famine. There's a famine in the land, and we're specifically reminded of the famine in Abraham's time. We're told this is a different famine. And the famine in 1210 that drove Abraham to Egypt, that was years before. This is a new one that Isaac experiences. And to escape the worst of this famine, Isaac goes to the southwest of Canaan into Philistine territory. Now, this is a reminder, if we needed one, that being God's chosen people doesn't exempt us from trouble, does it? Like Jesus taught his disciples, in this world you will have trouble. The same sun shines and the same rain falls on righteous and unrighteous alike. The presence of trouble isn't necessarily a sign of divine displeasure. I mean, it's evident throughout this chapter that Isaac is being blessed by God, and yet he still experiences the hardships of famine and having to move to a different place, being displaced by natural or climatic disasters. Experiencing trouble isn't necessarily a sign that God is angry with you, but is an opportunity for faith. Well, that brings us on to the second track. The second track is marital deception. Now, I said that the presence of trouble is an opportunity for faith. Well, Isaac and Abraham's response to the trial of famine is marital deception. Now, each of them in their respective stories went somewhere and then, to avoid trouble, lied and said that his wife was his sister. And then maybe you remember in Abraham's case, it's like, it's kind of true, she's my half-sister. But it's shameful, isn't it? It greatly dishonours their wives. It's fueled by fear, not faith, for both Abraham and Isaac. They're like, well, people might do me in because she's really beautiful. And in both cases, it almost backfires catastrophically. Now, Abraham did this twice, if you remember, in chapters 12 and chapter 20. And the second time was with another king, Abimelech of Gerar. It probably isn't the same person because of the time scale involved. It's probably a dynastic name. So if that was Abimelech the first, this is Abimelech the second or the third or something like that. And yet for both Abraham and Isaac, God intervenes and saves them, doesn't he? He protects Abraham and Sarai. He protects Isaac and Rebekah. Now, just a word to adults and even to older siblings. The children in our lives, the younger people, whether they're our children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews or friends or brothers or sisters, the younger people around us will study our lives closely. Because we model for them what the life of faith looks like. They're like, what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, it means to be like, so-and-so at church, or my mum and dad, or my grandparents. That's what Christianity looks like. So the mistakes and bad choices that we make have great power to harm the generation below us. Even though Isaac wasn't born at the time his father lied about Sarai, it seems like Abraham has laid a pattern that Isaac is then inclined to follow. Isn't it a great incentive to not sin? Understanding that sin never just impacts us. Because if we were really clear-headed, right, whenever an opportunity comes to sin, you think, well, I'll get some short-term pleasure maybe, and then a long-term negative thing, then just that alone would be reason enough to say no to sin. Because ultimately it's not good, is it? It hurts us. But when you remember, it doesn't just hurt you, it hurts the people around you. It has great power to harm these little ones. Wouldn't it be better if we had a millstone tied around our neck and were thrown into the heart of the sea than to cause one of these little ones, those lesser in faith than us, to sin? And yet, this passage also teaches us something maybe just as important, or even more important. God is not limited by our failings. He and his plans for his people are bigger than our sin. It is bigger than our bad decisions. He is good. He is merciful. He does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. Or 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13 says, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted or tested beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Well, let's move on. Track number 3 is material prosperity. Okay, material prosperity. And we see this is something that runs through both Isaac and Abraham's lives, and it especially ties into after they've deceived the king about their wife's identity. You see it in chapter 12 verse 16 and 20, chapter 20 verse 14, and here in verses 12 and 13. Both Abraham and Isaac become very wealthy. And notice in verse 12 how clear the source of this wealth is, because the Lord blessed him. Now, when it says, Isaac planted crops and it gave 100-fold, and that sounds like a lot. 100-fold harvest is ridiculous. If you get 3-fold harvest, you'd think you were doing all right. 100-fold harvest, that's ridiculous. Ridiculous isn't even ridiculous enough, is it? This is sort of mind-blowing success. This is the kind of success that everyone around you would just not believe. They'd think you were lying. They'd think you were cheating. That's that same 100-fold success that Jesus talks about in the parable of the sower, isn't it? 100-fold. God gives a crazy amount of wealth. Because God made promises to Abraham and then to Isaac, and in spite of their behavior at times, he is determined to bless them, to prosper them. Now, sadly, this is something that Isaac's son Jacob is going to take a while to learn. Friendship with God ultimately brings happiness. That's something to bear in mind through the trials of life, isn't it? God's ultimate aim, his end goal for his people, is blessing. It is good, not evil. A big principle here is that real blessing, the kind of blessing that is worth having, comes from God. It's not something that we, by our behavior, can carve out for ourselves by our blood, sweat, toil, and tears. Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat. If and when we become financially well off, because there's a hard balance here between going down a health and wealth prosperity gospel lie and just this idea that God isn't for us. But if and when we become financially well off, and remember that relative to most of the population of this planet, the majority of us we are fabulously wealthy. We have enough money to buy food. We have enough money to keep a roof over our heads and to keep ourselves clothed. That's insane, isn't it? It's amazing. That feels a bit like 100-fold, that we are just so materially well off. We've got a choice of things that we can buy at the supermarket. We can, you can get the own brand stuff, you can get the Tesco stuff, you get the Tesco's finest stuff, or you can get the really posh stuff. You've got such a variety. We are financially well off, most of us. And yet, is our response pride and entitlement, or is it a grateful acknowledgement of God's kindness? Because how often do we thank God for all that he has blessed us with, materially speaking? Well, track number 4 is conflict over the land. Now, do you remember back in chapter 13, verse 7, a quarrelling arose between Abraham's herders and those of his nephew Lot? Or you could think back to after Abraham rescued Lot from the kings who captured him, and then the king of Sodom kind of comes out and he wants to give Abraham a load of stuff. And there's a tension in their interaction as Abraham says, no, I'm not interested in what you have to give me. Now here we see a conflict over the land arise between Isaac and his herders and the Philistines, the local inhabitants of the land. And they keep filling up the wells, don't they, that Isaac's herdsmen need to water his flocks. It's a way of driving him out of the area, kind of salting the earth, making it impossible for him to stay, making it too much trouble. This is the same kind of conflict that happens in the world today, where you have one settled group of people and you have a nomadic people group, and they're conflicting over the available resources. And Isaac moves multiple times, doesn't he? So he's moved because of the famine, and he's kind of ping-ponging, bouncing around in this area. And we see more and more the idea that this land that they're fighting over, this land that has been promised, this land that is so central to everything God has said will happen, is worth fighting over. We're foreshadowing the conquest. There's a conflict over this patch of real estate in the Middle East. Only Isaac doesn't fight, does he? Did you notice that? There is conflict over the land, but heated as it might be, with these wells getting filled in, and maybe it came to fisticuffs between the herdsmen, we don't know. But for Isaac, it never escalates into violence. He never says, let's go in and take it back. Abimelech asks Isaac to move away from us. You've become too powerful for us, in verse 6. That at least carries the hint, verse 16. It at least carries the hint that Isaac had the men and influence to take a stand and carry out a military campaign to seize the land by force. I mean, Abimelech's kind of afraid of him. He's powerful enough that, as we see in a minute, this king of the Philistines feels pressured into making a non-aggression pact with Isaac. That's something you put in place when you're frightened of someone's political and military force. If he thought Isaac wasn't a threat, he'd have just left him, wouldn't he? But Isaac doesn't fight. He doesn't go to war. He just moves on, and he digs new wells until there's no quarrel. Isaac, you see, is trusting in God to give him the land. It is not his job to take it by force. And as he says in verse 22, now the Lord has given us root. Like Abraham, Isaac trusts God, not the king of Sodom, not himself, not anyone else, to give him what he's promised. He doesn't have to take up arms himself. Now, how often do we share that same faith? Trusting in God rather than men or our own strength. Do we need to win every argument? Do we have to go to war with our neighbours over the littlest thing? Are we content, even when it is hard, to wait on the Lord? Well, track number 5 is calling on the name of the Lord. Because Abraham travelled around the land, putting up altars and worshipping God. At Beersheba, in chapter 21, he planted a tree, tamarisk tree, and he called on the name of the Lord, the eternal God. Now here Isaac, and notice in the very same place, does the very same thing. He calls on the name of the Lord. He calls on the name of Yahweh. He calls on the name of Jehovah. He's not just hoping in God's promises in a kind of abstract way. He is active in his worship. He's active in his relationship with God. It seems that, like it was for Abraham, the blessing of God doesn't just mean material prosperity. It's an all-of-life deal. It's worship and love and service. It's not just one way. God blesses and Isaac responds. God isn't just heavenly fire insurance or hope for the afterlife, pie in the sky when we die. The Lord, Yahweh, is the one who is to be known and worshipped now. He's to be thanked when things go well. He's to be cried out to when things are tough. He's there for the good days. He's there for the bad days. Is that something that we grasp? Do we love and serve God, whether we get rich in this life or not, because knowing and being known by him is riches beyond anything else that we could ever have in this life? Well, track 6, the final track on this compilation album, is a treaty at Beersheba. Now, maybe you're not as excited by that. Let's go back one. Calling on the name of the Lord, that feels kind of theologically important. This is just some political stuff I'm not interested in. A treaty at Beersheba. Because if you were to flick back to chapter 21, verses 22 to 34, you read an account that sounds very similar to this one. You know, you've even got people wearing the same hats. You've got a Philistine king called Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his forces. That's probably a rank, then the Phicol maybe, rather than a name or a family name, something like that. And he comes to make a treaty with Isaac. Now, both times the Philistines acknowledge that God is with Isaac. And they realize that the way for them to be blessed is not to try and go in and take everything that Isaac has or that Abraham has. It's not to go and militarily defeat him. The way to be blessed is to enter into an agreement with God's chosen. It's a foretaste of God's promises coming true and a sign of how God's plan to bring blessing through Abraham and now Isaac isn't meant to stay with a blessing of just one man. That 100-fold blessing is for the blessing of all nations. Why is there more blessing than Isaac can take? Because he's not going to keep it to himself. Anyone who chooses to bless God's anointed, anyone willing to bow the knee. God's blessing through Abraham isn't meant to be limited to any one ethnicity. It is meant to spread out over all the world. And there you go. There's a little highlight of Abraham's greatest hits. We've seen, haven't we, how in many ways Isaac's life story repeats Abraham's. And maybe you think, well, it's kind of interesting if you're into that sort of thing. But what's the point? You know, Isaac is in some ways, and I'll apologize to him in advance for when I meet him in glory, but he's the least interesting of the patriarchs. Going through Genesis, Isaac's boring. He's kind of passive. There's not much written about him compared to the many chapters that we get about Abraham or Jacob or Joseph. And as we've seen, his life just reads like a tribute act to his father. Now, if I could have gone and seen the real Beatles, I wouldn't have been spending money going to see the Cavern Beatles in the Corro. I'd have wanted to see the real deal, wouldn't I? I only settled for the tribute act because I couldn't see the real thing. Is Isaac a supermarket own brand product? Is he a knockoff Gucci handbag? Did the writer of Genesis just phone it in that day and copy and paste a few bits to fill up space? Or is the repetition that is being highlighted for us what is important? Is it instead that the chapter shows us the wonderful nature of the inheritance that we've just read about Jacob swindling his brother Esau out of? This chapter, you see, proves to us that Isaac is indeed the recipient of the covenant promises made to Abraham. This is what's on the line. The blessing to all nations is really being passed down to Isaac. And we keep getting foretastes of everything that God is going to bring about. Because Isaac, like Abraham, lives as a sojourner. That word is mentioned at the start of the chapter, isn't it? He never owns more than a scrap of the promised land. He never owns more of that than the tomb he's buried in. But we see enough here to know that not one word of God's promises will fail. We see that this is a promise that can really and genuinely be handed down. Now, twice in this chapter, verses 3-5 and verse 24, that promise is repeated directly to Isaac. This is not something that we're supposed to miss. This is what's on the table. This is what God will do for Isaac, just as he did for Abraham. There's a wonderful reassurance here for all of us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. God's blessing passes down through the years without getting stale or running out, showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, if your kid's raised in Christian homes, maybe you think, yeah, that worked fine for my parents, but it just don't work for me. This same blessing is available to you as was available to your parents. It doesn't run out of steam with the passing of years. Now, Isaac's life wasn't exactly the same as his father's. He was his own man. He made his own choices, and in several cases, he made better choices than his father did. And at least he only lied about his wife once that we know about. But God's faithfulness and goodness was an unchanging constant. And I think maybe some of the reason that Isaac kind of strikes us as a bit boring is because of how God saves him from the mistakes his father made. This helps us see how God works, doesn't it? Because neither Abraham nor Isaac are perfect, are they? They have low points. And the Bible never claims that they were sinlessly perfect. And yet what matters for both Abraham and Isaac is that they obey God. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, even though all of God's promises had been made about and through Isaac. And here Isaac's willing to stay in the land, even when there's famine, even when there's conflict, even when he's so afraid of what the locals will do to him that he lies about his wife. It's easy to miss, but right back at the start of this chapter, God specifically tells Isaac not to go down to Egypt like Abraham had done back in chapter 12, but to stay in the land. And what does Isaac do? He obeys. Covenant obedience brings covenant blessing. Now, it's not mechanical. God isn't a one-armed bandit or a vending machine. It's not an input-output simple thing. But we see that there is great blessing in obeying God, even when we make mistakes, even when we sin, where the overall trajectory of our life is one that goes with God and not against him. He blesses us. It's not something that we can wrest from his hand, and it doesn't mean that if we obey God, we're going to get a Ferrari or we're only going to be really wealthy and we'll never get ill. That's nonsense. But it means that God will bless us. God will lead us to good, not evil. Abraham, through his obedience, secured covenant blessings for his seed. And we see that pattern continuing in Isaac. And as I wrap up, maybe that makes you despair. Because it's hard to obey God sometimes, isn't it? Even if we think it's like an overall trajectory kind of thing rather than a 100% batting average, that's hard, isn't it? It can be costly. The unbelievers around us don't like it when God's people obey him. Because it makes us stand out. It makes us different. It can make their life more difficult, they think. Obeying God might mean falling out with friends. It might mean relationship breakdown. It might mean family cutting you off. You might lose your job. And we feel pressured to conform to this world by forces outside us. And we've got enough sin still living in us that there is internal pressure pushing us away from the path of obedience. So while we need to remember the pattern that covenant obedience secures covenant blessing, we need also to remember that we are Christians. Christians are heirs of the new covenant, a covenant that isn't secured by our obedience, but by the perfect obedience of Christ. Abraham's obedience secured great covenant blessing for Isaac. And we see the reality of that blessing in this chapter. But rather than compare ourselves with Isaac or Abraham, isn't it better to think about how Christ's obedience has secured even greater covenant blessings for his seed, for his offspring, for his church? Would you rather have 100-fold harvest, or would you rather have everlasting life? Would you rather have peace in a little bit of the Middle East, or would you rather have friendship with God and the adoption to sonship? Would you rather inherit what Isaac had, or what Jesus promises to his church? There is blessing for those who obey God, and so we ought to obey God. But the blessing isn't guaranteed by our obedience, but by God's gracious, sovereign hand. It's secured in the fact that Jesus went to the cross, suffered for our sins, and rose again. That motivates our obedience out of gratitude for everything God has given us, not as something that we need to fight for and claim for ourselves. Doesn't seeing Jesus make even Abraham and all his obedience look like a tribute act? What transformation might we see in our lives, or our families, or our community if we took a leaf out of Abraham and Isaac's book and did the same thing? Let's sing again, 274, God of the Covenant.